My name is Tracy Craig. I'll be moderating the meeting. Thank you all of you for joining us. This is the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board's community update for the Bayridge Park HOA. We're going to be talking about the Ford Aeronutronics property tonight, give you an update on that, and specifically talk about the human health risk assessment and the soil vapor extraction system pilot results. Next slide, John. Few ground rules. This meeting is being recorded, and we're happy to send the recording to anybody that wants it or is unable to attend the meeting. You'll be muted when you come on. Everybody has audio and visual feed. That means we can see you and we can hear you, but when you come in, you'll be muted. To talk, you'll need to unmute your microphone. Questions will be answered throughout the presentation. We're really here that we're going to present some dense information tonight. We want to make sure that people understand it. So please feel free to pause us at any time to ask clarifying questions, ask us to present information in a different way. It's important that you understand this information we give you tonight. You can ask questions a couple ways. You can talk in the chat box, which is the little box at the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand, or you can just unmute your microphone. We'll also be stopping at about every slide and making sure, asking if anybody has any questions before we move on to the next slide. For property-specific questions, you can put your name and number in the chat box, and we will call you back and set up an appointment to discuss your property specifically. This is a high-level overview of the entire Bayridge area. You can also contact our property information line. I believe that John Cremani, John, raise your hand. He's taking notes tonight too. He put a lot of information in the chat box. You can just take a picture of that with your phone if you like, and that refers you how to get more information on the site. Next slide, John. Purpose of the meeting tonight, as I said, is to discuss the human health risk assessment, the soil vapor extraction pilot test, talk about what we'll be doing next, and most importantly, to answer your questions. We have a lot of ancillary information, handouts that have definitions of acronyms. We sometimes use other things that you can get online, and you can just go to the chat function again and access the Ford website for this, and you'll be able to get that information. And then tonight, to do the presentation, we have people from the Water Board. We have people from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which we call OEHA, which is a lot easier to say. And then, of course, we have Ford's consultant, Wood Environmental and Infrastructure. I think most of you have probably met them by now. Next slide is our agenda, I think. Again, we have about a 20-minute presentation. I would like to introduce people and just have them raise their hands right now. You can read the presentation yourselves, but Karen Kelly from Wood, would you please raise your hand? Okay, Amanda. I think a lot of folks know Amanda. She's presented several times. Everybody knows Jessica Law, who is our project manager with the Water Board. Jessica Law's boss is Nick Amini. And Nick, if you would raise your hand as well. There you are. Okay. And then we have Mike Barnes, who is with Wood. And then Daniela, who also works with him. And we have Usha, who I think people might have met before. She's with Wood, and she is a health risk assessor as well. And I think that's all I have. Any questions for me? I'm going to follow my own rule of stopping and asking if we have questions. No? Okay, good. Then we will go into the presentation. I'll hand it over to Karen, please.
I almost forgot to unmute myself. Well, good evening, Bayridge Park. As Tracy introduced, my name is Karen Kelly. And I just wanted to start off and explain that, we acknowledge that this is an important document, and Wood has a large team of scientists specifically trained to prepare risk assessments. You've been introduced to Usha previously, and both of us sign off on these documents as senior members of that team. As Tracy mentioned, Usha is also in attendance, and she will help answer questions if you have any for the Wood Risk Assessment team. And a risk assessment is all about the chance of an event occurring. Risk perception is about choices and behavior, and those opinions vary by individual. So we conduct a quantitative risk assessment to inform those choices. We make some risk management recommendations in the HRA, or the health risk assessment, human health risk assessment, but ultimately risk management is the water board's role. This slide introduces the 4 key components of a standard risk assessment, and they were presented by Jessica at the community-wide meeting in November. Wood has done all of these steps in the risk assessment, and that is what we are reporting on tonight. It's important to note that the more data we feed into this process, the more confidence we have in the results. The data and exposure evaluation are based on data collected over approximately 2 years of investigation. This process is purposefully designed by regulatory agencies to estimate risk results that are health protective. For example, one assumption in the risk assessment is that people are home for 24 hours a day, 350 days a year for 26 years of their lifetime, and they only leave for vacation 2 weeks out of the year. Jessica also presented this slide on risk management at the community-wide meeting. The take-home message from this slide is that a bunch of numbers come out of the risk assessment. Some are based on the chance of cancer, and some are based on non-cancer hazards, which are other health effects not related to cancer. Based on the range of numbers you see on the left-hand part of the slide, we put those results in decision boxes on the right. When a result is in the red range, agencies like the Water Board recommend that some action needs to occur to reduce those risks. When a result is in the yellow range, we need to determine what to do next, but it usually involves or includes more investigation. When a result is in the green range, it means the health risk is considered insignificant and no action needs to occur. And please, as Tracy mentioned, if you have questions in between my slides, feel free to ask. So my first point on this HHRA approach slide is to bring up that Wood used a health protective approach consistent with the data that we collected and a technical approach memo that was reviewed by the Water Board and OEHA. However, we understand we've thrown a lot of numbers at you in the risk assessment, meaning we have presented the results several different ways. It was for good reasons, but it is probably confusing. First, we evaluated what we called current conditions based on indoor air measurements collected the past 2 years or so. However, we don't know how those indoor air measurements may change over time. And as I mentioned before, we will assume you live in your houses for a long time, 26 years into the future. So we have to try to predict a range of future possibilities. Therefore, we presented the potential future risk 3 different ways. We used a default screening approach based on data collected in US EPA's nationwide database. This approach is the most stringent. We also used a parcel-wide approach based on all the data collected in your neighborhood. We used this approach to recommend next steps and thought it was the most appropriate and still health protective for decision-making. Well, why do we think it's more appropriate, you might ask? The data set collected in your neighborhood is larger than the relevant data in the nationwide database, meaning that the nationwide database only has data from 4 houses with a similar slab on grade foundation to those in your neighborhood. In fact, California agencies are compiling data from this investigation and other vapor intrusion investigations like it in California to come up with a more applicable California-specific database. And lastly, we also presented future potential risks under a building-specific evaluation, which was based on the data in your building instead of the whole neighborhood. In short, it assumes that the vapor intrusion conditions won't change significantly over time. So this slide is to put cancer risk in perspective. And of course, talking about cancer is scary. But when we are talking about cancer risk, we're talking about chance. And the point of this slide is to put the chance of other events occurring, like getting struck by lightning or rolling dice, and the risk of results for Bayridge Park in context of those cancer risk decision boxes we discussed earlier. So in the US, we have a 4 in 10 chance of getting some form of cancer over our lifetime. That risk would be at the top of this chart in red, higher than the chance of rolling a 1 on 1 die. For current conditions, using indoor air data, no houses fell into the red specifically for cancer risk. So that means 17 properties were in the yellow range and 49 properties were in the green. And you can see the icons on the right demonstrating that. Future risk has a larger range of possibilities, meaning we estimated risks from red to green because we can't predict the future. So remember, we evaluated 3 different scenarios. So when we have results in the red and yellow, we can do something about it. And that is the focus of Jessica's presentation. The next steps after the risk assessment are done in an effort to move properties into the green or that insignificant risk range. So this next slide is a snapshot of the current condition results. The take-home message from the indoor air assessment is that most of the properties evaluated are in the green, so 49 out of 66. The interim mitigation measures like sealing cracks in a foundation or providing air purifiers has been effective at moving more properties to the green, so 55 instead of 49 on that chart. And as another example, one property did have a non-cancer hazard above 1, and then that hazard index was reduced to yellow under mitigation. So this is the future conditions figure from the risk assessment report, and we added colored circles to give you perspective related to those decision boxes that I discussed. And the key messages from this is that recall that this is just an estimate based on soil gas measurements, and it doesn't represent the air you're breathing right now. This prediction is not set in stone. It is just one future scenario that would used to make recommendations. And the red circles are because of non-cancer hazard indices estimated greater than 1. And the yellow circles are because of cancer risk estimated greater than 1 in a million, which is considered the insignificant risk level by regulatory agencies. The water board will use the future results to make long-term decisions for how to manage the site in a health protective way. Since the water board is using the results of the wood risk assessment to inform their decisions, recall that they have a WEHA independently review the risk results, as Amanda is going to discuss next. So thank you for your time, and please let us know if you have questions, and I'll turn it over to Amanda.
So while we're transitioning, I'm just going to ask our attendees if you have any questions, and if you do, please raise your hand. Okay, I think we are. Bud, are you raising your hand? Hey, Bud, are you raising your hand, or are we just seeing your hand? Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. So like they said, my name is Amanda, and I work for the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which we also call a WEHA. So my organization routinely reviews health risk assessments for the water boards and government agencies. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the purpose of our review and the results of our review. So the purpose of the OEHA review is to check whether the risk assessment is reliable for the project manager, who is Jessica in this case, to use to make decisions about the site. And part of this is ensuring that the risk assessment is also health protective. So during the review, I usually check the calculations and the resulting values, and I explain any differences. I also check that the sampling data are representative of the exposure conditions and point out uncertainties. For example, if not enough samples were taken. So OEHA generally does not determine how the risks will be addressed. This process of the OEHA review is just about making sure that the risks are described accurately. Okay, so for my review of the assessment of Bayridge Park, in general, Wood followed appropriate guidance and calculations were correct. There were some differences. I'm going to talk about two. One of them was that I calculated cancer risk that was 3 times higher because OEHA uses a particular factor to protect children from chemicals that cause cancer. Wood, on the other hand, followed guidance from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies within California's Environmental Protection Agency. So this is a difference in scientific opinion between agencies, and we see this in many cases. It's a difference that can affect outcomes, but not a huge difference in a risk assessment. So for example, my calculations bumped 16 of the homes up from the top of the green into the bottom of the yellow zone. But still in the big picture, risks are generally low and there's no homes in the red. The second difference that I was going to talk about is in the way that OEHA recommends evaluating future risk. So the health risk might be different in the future if, for example, someone remodels their home or a foundation cracks, and as a result, more contaminants are able to move into the home, which in turn can increase the health risk. So this is really challenging to evaluate because we don't know the future and how it'll affect health risks. So Wood included 3 different calculations to estimate the future risk, which is helpful to see the different approaches. However, OEHA recommended the more protective approach, which follows the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency guidance. OEHA's approach resulted in estimates that were 30 to 90 times higher than Wood's 2 other approaches. So again, this is for the hypothetical future risk estimates, not what was measured recently in your homes. I recommended this more protective of the 3 approaches in order to account for things that can increase risk in the future, such as a cracking foundation. This recommendation is also typical of the OEHA reviews. We often identify uncertainties we feel are significant and recommend a more protective option. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jessica.
And again, I'm going to pause us and see if anybody has any questions. Okay. Jessica?
All right. You can see my screen good?
We can.
Okay. So for the water board response, we evaluated the results from the risk assessment that Wood prepared, and then we looked at the comments and results from OEHA's review. And based on that, we considered the current risk and hazard results, as well as the future risk and hazard results for the next steps. So first I want to talk about the current risk and hazard, which did identify vapor intrusion is occurring at a few properties. And I'm going to discuss those ranges identified on the next slide. The second conclusion is acknowledging the unknown future conditions, such as building modifications and or the degradation of a building foundation, such as cracks, that may increase vapor intrusion in the future. And as a result, future risk and hazard is calculated and considered in those next steps. And I'll talk on those ranges in a couple slides. So now I want to discuss the results, what these ranges mean that were calculated and how it informs our next steps. So first I want to talk about the current risk and hazard ranges, which were calculated from the indoor air sampling results. And just a reminder, when I talk about risk, I'm referring to cancer risk. And when I talk about hazard, I'm referring to the non-cancer health effects. Also, these calculations assume you are in your home 24 hours a day, 350 days a year for a 26-year period. So the current risk range, and this was from OEHA's calculations, the risk range falls from the green to the yellow areas, which means for homes that do not have exceedances of the screening levels, those are in the green area and there's no immediate response action needed. For homes that fall into the yellow area, they've already been offered mitigation measures, and that information lets us know that a longer term solution is necessary, whether it's going to be mitigation or remediation. And then for hazard, homes that do not exceed this threshold of 1 can fall into that green or yellow area depending on the risk that was calculated for the home. And that's why this range looks so big. There was one home that did exceed 1, and due to that exceedance, or that exceedance was primarily due to the exceedance of short action levels of TCE. And again, homes that fall into either the yellow or the red have been offered temporary mitigation measures. And this information helps to inform us that a longer term solution is necessary. So for future risk and hazard, these ranges are calculated based on soil gas concentrations. And at the beginning of the presentation, Wood did mention that they calculated the future risk scenario 3 different ways. One of the 3 ways was that most protective scenario that they calculated, and that's how OEHA calculates risk. And so it's important to also note that these future risk and hazard calculations are not guaranteed. It's an unknown right now if there will be any change to current risk calculations. And that's why we do want to do some longer term monitoring and also consider these future risk and hazard calculations in our next steps. And again, these are from OEHA's calculations. And as I mentioned on the last slide, they assume you are in your home 24 hours a day, 350 days a year for a 26-year period. So the future risk and hazard ranges, they ranged from yellow to red. Therefore, the Water Board evaluates the current risk and hazard ranges to determine the most appropriate next steps. So the potential response actions in this case could be monitoring, mitigation, or remediation. And also we take into consideration a higher estimation when evaluating risk and hazard calculations. So an example of what we do with these results, if a home has a future risk or hazard that falls in that yellow area, but there's current risk and hazard data that has that home in the green area, monitoring is probably going to be the most appropriate path forward. If a home has a future risk or hazard that's up in that red, and the current risk and hazard is in the yellow, we're looking at probably longer term mitigation or remediation along with monitoring for the appropriate path forward. And really the point I want to make is that it takes into consideration the current indoor air results and future risk and hazard calculations for gas concentrations to support the risk management decisions, which are those next steps.
Jessica, I have last sentence because you're cutting out when you move away, so you need to stay closer to your computer.
Yes.
Thank you.
You bet. So the last sentence that I had was really just that the main point is that the Water Board takes into consideration both current and future risk and hazard calculations to support those risk management decisions, which are going to be those next steps. So from the risk assessment report, we identified the need for long-term mitigation and/or remediation in some areas, as well as the need to conduct some longer-term indoor air monitoring. As a result, the next steps include the submittal of 2 reports, the Feasibility Study and Remedial Action Plan, which was submitted on April 9th, and the revised Indoor Air Monitoring Plan, which was submitted on February 24th. So first I want to talk about the Feasibility Study wrap, and this is a comprehensive report that will include 3 main items. So first, it proposes remedial action objectives, which are the goals of the remediation efforts. And these remedial action objectives need to be protective of public health, and they also need to be technically feasible to be implemented in the field. The second is the feasibility study. In this portion of the report, it looks at all of the remedial options and evaluates the feasibility of implementing them to achieve the remedial action objective. And the main components of the feasibility study take into consideration the ability to implement the technology, the effectiveness of the technology, as well as the cost. And then some other factors include acceptance by the regulatory agency, as well as acceptance by the public. And then the third component of this report will be to propose a remedy based on the feasibility study and the remedial action objective. Then there's the indoor air monitoring plan. And this is a longer term plan to evaluate indoor air to verify if vapor intrusion changes over time. And this is where we may take into consideration the parcel-wide attenuation factor calculation that would develop. There's been a lot of data collected within this community, and this is an appropriate way to utilize it. This longer term monitoring plan will provide analytical data to support whether the current risk and hazard calculations are still appropriate or not. The monitoring frequency will be based on soil gas concentrations and trends, and the frequency of sampling can range from every 6 months to once every 5 years. So that ends the risk assessment portion of this presentation, and I'm going to talk about the soil vapor extraction pilot test. But before we start talking about this, I just want to pause and see if there's any risk assessment questions. And feel free to unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, Nancy, and talk. We're very informal tonight. There you
I
go.
have a question. Throughout this process, we have never been able to be told what our common wall units, the next door neighbors are, where we share an attic, where we share common walls. So if a unit has one level, but on the other side of the wall, they maybe have better issues or worse issues than myself, how do we not have that available to us? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so on that's taken into consideration with those next steps. And we have been throughout the process just trying to maintain and respect individuals' privacy.
Sure.
And because there is, that the shared wall aspect, homes that have been screened and haven't had exceedances, and this happened about, I think it was 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, we identified the need that even these homes that have been kind of given the green light and they're good and don't have exceedances should still continue to be monitored if there's exceedances in the buildings, the units around them. And that way we can still maintain a protectiveness for those tenants.
Where our garage is beneath somebody else's unit, it's not beneath ours. I mean, again, we have no idea if there's something in that unit and it's coming from our garage. I just, these are all like interconnections type of things.
I'm gonna make a note to look into some additional considerations for that and get back to you.
Yes, so if somebody has high levels, their neighbors who share maybe the same bedroom wall, they should have kind of the right to know, the same as their garage, whether your garage is not attached to your unit, but if.
Or is that considered in the mitigation if you're not getting any, high enough readings in one unit?
Yeah. So that's where this risk assessment comes into play. And maybe it makes sense to, I don't have that slide. We can go back to that figure that Karen showed that had the figure they put in the risk assessment. And one of the things they did was each building unit, so the multiple units associated with the one foundation, are
Yeah.
all lumped together in the risk management decisions. So it wouldn't be, just you've got units 1 through 5 sharing a foundation, and unit 2 has vapor intrusion occurring, but 1 and 3, 4 and 5 are good. We're going to be looking at implementing long-term mitigation for all of it.
Okay.
And it would, to address that, because that is a possibility. And it could be how a home is operated as far as their HVAC system, cracks in the foundation. There's so many unknowns. So we will be the building as a whole versus
Okay.
individual.
Okay, so the cluster will be,
Yes.
okay, it will be communicated. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you for asking questions.
All right. So if there's no other questions right now, and then we can pause and come back to any of these slides at the end, then I'll start talking about the soil vapor extraction pilot test. So first, I just want to give a refresher about soil vapor extraction, which is also referred to as SVE. And SVE is a remedial technology that can remove vapors from the soil above groundwater. So it's this area up in here. Here's this familiar inlay that shows soil particles and how vapors can reside just between those spaces of the soil. The pilot test itself, that consisted of one extraction well location that had 2 extraction wells. One was shallow in the soil, and then one was deeper, just it extended almost down to groundwater. This pilot test ran for a total of 15 days, for a total of 130 hours. And during this time, nearby soil gas probes were monitored to evaluate a couple things. First, looking at vacuum pressure to see if and how much effect the extraction well is having. And then second, soil vapor data is collected from the extraction wells and those nearby soil gas probes, both before and after the pilot test. And this data that's collected during the pilot test was used to evaluate the radius of influence, which I have kind of identified as this elliptical on this figure. And this just lets us know how far does the vacuum from those extraction wells reach, both laterally and vertically, and then how much contamination is being removed during this pilot test. So first I want to talk about the radius of influence and the pilot test results. And again, this is how far the vacuum effect on the extraction well reaches. So industry standard radius of influence of a typical site would say that a 20 to 50 foot radius of influence is considered satisfactory. For this site, the shallow extraction well, that had a radius of influence of 72 feet. And then the deeper extraction well had a radius of influence of 68 feet. So these results indicate a good radius of influence for the area. The second metric that's looked at is how much mass was removed. And again, that's how much contamination was removed from below the ground. So industry standards of a typical site suggest mass removal of 1 pound per day or greater at the start of soil vapor extraction as satisfactory. For this site, during the pilot test, 0.23 pounds total was removed in 15 days, or that 130 hours of operations. And these results are consistent with the lower VOC concentrations that are detected in the subsurface in this area. So the results of the pilot test will be used in the feasibility study when evaluating the best remedial approach for the site. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, that feasibility study takes into consideration the ability to implement the technology, the effectiveness of the technology, and cost, as well as acceptance by the regulatory agency and acceptance by the public. And for those of you that were at the public meeting in November 2019, you may remember my analogy about the effectiveness of soil vapor extraction based on the soil type by comparing it to the milkshake versus a slushie. So the radius of influence results from the pilot test indicates slushy. So the type of soil below the ground was favorable based on that metric. But the mass removal rates indicates, and I think the best way to kind of put this is that almost finished slushy where you suck on it, it's mostly ice and all the liquid is mostly gone. You only get a little bit out. So in that regard, SVE may not be as favorable, but these are just the considerations which are important and are in the feasibility study and used when determining the remedial approach for the site. So to summarize, the risk assessment results support risk management decisions. The feasibility study remedial action plan was submitted to the Water Board on April 9th, 2021, so just a couple weeks ago. The SVE pilot test results are used in the remedy evaluation, and the response is pending. Water Board, or our response is pending, just review of this document right now. And then we are going to be hosting a meeting in June for the Bayridge Park community to discuss this feasibility study, remedial action plan, and to receive any public feedback. So for additional information, as always, GeoTracker is the state's database where all the reports and data gets uploaded. There's LIRIS list, which is the Water Board's email notification. You can sign up for that. We will send out email blasts when the next public meeting will be. The Water Board has a webpage specific for this project. There is Ford's site-specific website and the 800 number. And then there's the local information repository at the local library there. So now we can transition into any additional questions.
I'd just like to say thank you for listening to the presentation. Again, most of the information on resources is in the chat box, so you can open that up and take a quick picture of how to get in touch with us. And particularly if you have property-specific questions, we're happy to meet with you offline and discuss those in detail. So I will now open this up for questions. Again, you can just raise your hand physically, raise your hand virtually with the little icon, or just unmute yourself and have at it. So please feel free to ask any questions.
I know this was a lot of information to take in tonight. So while you're thinking of questions, or even if you don't come up with any this evening, feel free to email me. That's the best way to get a hold of me, or reach out to that the Ford's 1-800 number with questions, and they will direct it to the most appropriate person as well. But that's a couple ways. If after this meeting you think of something else, please feel free to reach out and ask those questions later as well.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I have a question. So what you're saying is that the RAP has been submitted and is under review by the Water Board. Are we allowed to know what the recommendations are from Wood Environmental, what they're suggesting? Is the soil vapor extraction, sounds like it's not that affected because the levels are low. So I'm wondering if that's what they're proposing, or if they're proposing doing something different.
So I'm going to let Mike and Ken answer that. I've just barely glanced over it, but there were, in the feasibility study wrap, they provided 3 alternatives for our evaluation consideration, and we can take any one of those or none of those and say do over. But I'll let Ken and Mike talk on that a little bit more.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, as Jessica indicated, the purpose of the feasibility study and remedial action plan is to look at all alternatives. And so it was a very comprehensive document that looked at a variety of remedial options from groundwater to soil gas. I think to talk about the alternatives that we recommended, I think Daniela took the lead on this. So I'd like to hand it over to her, if that's okay to present that.
Yeah, sure. And I think the best way to sort of summarize what we recommended would be a multifaceted approach. So in our sort of, the alternative that we looked at, that we said, this is probably, the one that we would recommend moving forward with, it had kind of a combination of remedial actions. So the SVE technology is proposed to be used, but not across the whole site. So in sort of the certain areas where the soil gas concentration is the highest, because that's sort of where it'll have the most effect, and kind of be the best sort of use of kind of space and technology. For other like parts of the site that, maybe the health risk assessment still was kind of, the future was in the yellow, the remediation, the soil vapor extraction will obviously help the whole area, but to directly address some of these other homes that might not be under the influence of the soil vapor extraction system, doing something like a subslab depressurization system or a subslab venting system is what we recommend, which basically it's sort of a mouthful of a word, but you can picture it as a way to interrupt the migration of the impacted vapors from the subsurface into the home through what they call subslab depressurization or venting, so that the vapors, instead of coming from the ground through cracks in the foundation into your home, they're basically vented out of the home and either treated or diluted, so that they don't impact any of the residents. And then, like Jessica mentioned, another aspect of what we're recommending is going to be continued monitoring, because we want to make sure that those areas that we said, they look fine right now, there's the risk is really low. We want to make sure that that is maintained into the future. And if there was a change, and let's say, we see something different, we would be able to react and evaluate in a timely fashion, to some sort of future condition that we right now, can't anticipate.
Are you talking about indoor air monitoring or ground monitoring?
So it would be a both. The indoor air monitoring, we want to kind of reduce the frequency in the sense that we know it's pretty intrusive to homeowners, but that, it's important still that the indoor air monitoring is the most accurate way to evaluate whether there is an impact. So there would still be some indoor air monitoring, but we would also, and we shall continue monitoring the ground, the soil gas. And we right now do that 3 times a year, and we anticipate to continue doing that. And that helps us determine whether, conditions are changing at all. And if we saw something change, then we'd jump on, let's look at the indoor air in the homes in this area that's changed to see if that had an impact.
Okay. And then, so the subslab venting is something that could be done now that the homes are already built. There's some kind of
correct. So
process
there's no, I know in to people, homeowners and in this community, others, there's a fear that somehow we would have to like tear down buildings. That is not on the table. That is not a technology that we need to do. We have ability, the state of technology is we can do it with the building maintained structure in place. So you don't have to worry about that.
And there's no groundwater impacts. It's solely in the soil.
The groundwater does have some minor impacts, and we continue to monitor groundwater, and we have, for the past couple decades, but the groundwater beneath Bayridge Park is really deep. So it's like at 50 feet or greater. And so the sort of, when you look at from a health risk evaluation of the groundwater, there's no real way for you to interact with the groundwater. So it doesn't really pose a large risk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry to have so many questions. I appreciate you going through all that.
And this is Mike again. Excellent summary, Daniela. And I just want to add that document is on GeoTracker as well as the FordNBFacts.com website. So if anybody wants to take a look, it's there. It has not been reviewed or approved by the Water Board, but it is publicly available.
And we'll be getting started on that here soon. Once we do get that response out, we do want to, it's not a final response. We will share what the water board's recommended approach where we would like to see it go, but then we will also be taking any public feedback as well into consideration.
Excellent point. And therefore it's a draft document right now because it's going to be dynamic slightly.
And then Nick, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No.
Okay. He's our resident water board expert on remediation. So I utilize his expertise often. All right. Any other questions?
I think Ollie might be asking a question.
Yeah, hi. I heard one of your colleagues during her, I believe, presentation mentioned about the remodeling that sometimes affect, or is there any need to be concerned about the remodeling the unit, which is going to be bathroom and flooring and all those kind of things? What is the effectiveness of that and how we're going to approach that?
So
because I heard in the presentation, someone mentioned about remodeling and all those kind of things, because we want to make sure.
yeah, so some of the considerations when a home gets remodeled, for example, if new windows get installed, it can better seal up the house. And if a new HVAC system comes in or a bathroom fan and the home is better sealed, it can create a negative pressure inside the home. And that can allow more vapor intrusion to occur. And so that's why we want to continue that longer term monitoring. It's not a guarantee that home remodeling will affect vapor intrusion, because there's a number of things that do have to align, but it is something that we want to take into consideration and evaluate as much as possible.
Well, obviously, if we decided to do that, we're going to go through the homeowner association. Are they going to communicate with the proper team or something that what need to be done, or we are going to list it, for instance, what we are going to do or we have intent to do, and therefore what kind of rule and regulation is going to go through these?
So there isn't any kind of rule or regulation or policy, but when Wood comes in and does their indoor air monitoring, they do their building survey. And that'll be one of the questions correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle or Mike, but those are on the building survey and some of the questions they get asked, just because sometimes building materials, glues, adhesives can also contribute to indoor air. And so those are things that we want to know also as part of our evaluation. And in just the couple of considerations. But then again, nobody would necessarily need to notify us, but if there was a concern, that's where you'd reach out to Wood to, it's always a possibility to see when the next indoor air monitoring event for your residence is.
It's fair enough. Thank you. Okay.
Go ahead, Nancy, please. Unmute though. Yeah,
Hi, so I'm back. I have two questions. So again, if we end up having to do modifications for the foundation and things like that, where we're going to be venting or whatever, again, that will be done for an entire building where there's multiple homes within that. So it'd be like that cluster of homes that are sharing common walls, foundations, and attics and things. So that affects that whole cluster, correct?
That's correct. We wouldn't just with half of the home or try to put a remedy under half the slab. It would be across the whole.
All right.
One.
And then the second one is, early in the slides, we were talking about in the different green, yellow, and colors. There were 49 homes that were green, 16 yellow, and 1 red in one of the slides. And then there were others. We don't know what those are. Are those our own home? Whose home are they? Are they my next door neighbor? Are they above my garage? When will that be? I mean, will we ever be notified of who is in those colors? That's it.
So maybe we want to, in the last, because I know we're in the last like 5 minutes, do we want to pull up that figure, or would it be easier, Danielle or Mike, to speak with them offline to show them that figure that Karen had earlier on in the presentation?
I'd love to see that figure.
Well, then let me stop sharing.
Thank
And I'll have John put that back up.
I know that we're close on time, but we're happy to stay after a few minutes if you'd like us to, so you get the information that you need. And if you'd like to drop off and again, want to talk about your results or your home specifically, put your name in the chat box. We'll give you a ring back tomorrow.
Jessica, I think the figure that we're cruising over to is for future risks. And Nancy's question may have been about the number in the house on the slide before, which was current risks.
Yep.
One thing
I can pull up that document.
Yeah, it would be figures.
This is Karen. There's 2 figures in the report.
But one of the things, Nancy, just to note is that anyone whose indoor air data fell into that yellow or red zone, we contact them directly, offer them mitigation and kind of work with them to make sure we're not, by mistake picking up some sort of solvents that had been used in the home, or, so we do additional sampling and stuff like that. I know that doesn't answer your question as to whether you don't know about whether that's your next door neighbor or not, but
why wouldn't they be public information to all of us to know which units are affected according to your chart and range?
So this is Karen. There's 2 figures in the risk assessment report that you can pull up that's publicly available, and you can see color coding on each unit.
Okay, but will that tell us?
Current condition. So figure 7 is current conditions based on indoor air data, and there's figure 8, which is color coding based on future conditions or soil gas. And so that's the figure that was on the screen that Jessica had John bring up. So this is figure 8 in the risk assessment with some, circles added on top.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
this is Usha. So we don't put down the names of the homeowners in the report, obviously, privacy reasons, but you could take a closer look at the figure and basically work out which properties are actually indicated if you look at the location.
So we'll figure it out.
And we can set up a discussion because I don't want to necessarily say, okay, which home is yours? Again, we're trying to be respectful because it was concerns that have been expressed earlier on in the investigation about maintaining privacy and stuff. But we can really look at those figures that they mentioned within those risk assessment reports and talk about those calculations for where your unit is and what's surrounding it, and help just answer those questions you have. I am more than happy to set up that time for that.
Great, thank
Jessica,
you.
I got another question. And some of the conversation, the words intrusion and minimizing inconvenience and all of this. there is intrusion, there is huge inconvenience, you know, loss of parking stalls, you know, all of your equipment, you know, is anybody monitoring this, and how is that going to be mitigated? In other words, you've put holes into our asphalt and damaged asphalt. We've lost parking stalls for weeks at a time, when I know you don't live there, but the biggest problem in our complex is parking stalls. We've been inconvenienced with what you guys originally designed as non-intrusive, cute little machines that are going to sit in our house and, you know, do the air quality testing. Some units have had larger units outside on their decks. And then the mitigation that you talk about, putting in the venting systems and slanting under the units, these still, all of these end up in some kind of a product or something that visually is a reminder. Why it's there is because of hazardous material in the ground under our homes. And I guess my question is more to Bayridge. This has been a huge inconvenience, and I'm curious how eventually that inconvenience gets mitigated. And I guess the question I've asked from day one is, how are the property values doing when people disclose toxic? I mean, I hate to be one of the 17 units and try to sell my house. So long-term questions, I know there's not answers, but big questions to me, because we basically have just been taking it for a long time now.
So that is one of the reasons why, when it comes to that feasibility study and the remedial action plan, and what the water board decides, you know, what the most appropriate path forward is, why we do want to engage with the Bayridge Park community on what the plan is, what that looks like, and allow, you know, Wood to talk about how do they address the parking and not take up multiple parking spaces while they're doing installation. How do they make sure they aren't, that these concerns of yours are addressed, and that we hear them and we figure out the best solution to meet the end objective of getting this site cleaned up to the, you know, extent practicable, and get the site to closure and be done, so that there isn't the future monitoring, that there aren't the probes in the ground anymore, and these different activities occurring.
It's kind of gross as a homeowner.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are 2 minutes after. So again, I sound like the broken record. Check the chat box, and there's information in there. If you'd like to talk individually with Jessica about your property or have concerns that you don't want to share in a public forum, please call either the board hotline or email Jessica. And I am going to end the meeting. First of all, I'm going to thank all of you for coming, because I know you could have done other things tonight. We appreciate your participation. We'll be having another meeting, as Jessica said, in June, to get your input on the draft RAP. We'll be having a community meeting July 29th, and hopefully we'll be doing that in person and virtually. We're going to try a hybrid approach if we can do in person by then. And again, I want to thank you. I'm going to hang out on for a couple extra minutes here, just in case anybody needs to give me any separate information or wants to tell me they want a phone call. Other than that, you're all free to go. And I want to again thank you for your participation. Good night.